Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming onto this Zoom call. And hi, Edward. It's
Hi.
great to see you again. And I'd like to introduce my colleague, Katie, to you. Katie is in English and Drama at Queen Mary with me. And Abbie, who's working with us on a PhD about the reception of Antigone. So exactly perfect for today's discussion. And I wonder, before we get started, Katie, whether you could give us an outline of the plot of Sophocles' Antigone, which is the ultimate inspiration for Ed's piece.
So we have to understand that this play obviously is beginning in medias res, in the middle of things. And those middle of things are that Oedipus has died, King Oedipus, the famous Oedipus, has died, and his sons have killed each other in a battle for the throne of Thebes. So they fought one another. It's a kind of civil war, a kind of fratricidal war, with one brother representing the city, actually, and another seen as a kind of outsider. And the outsider brother, Polynices, has been decreed by the then ruler of Thebes, so who has now taken control, that is Creon, Antigone's uncle. He's seen as having betrayed the city, and for having betrayed the city in fighting against his brother Eteocles, he has been condemned to be unburied. His body is to be left to be carrion, to be eaten by birds and dogs. And of course, in ancient cultures, or in many cultures, that's a kind of completely abhorrent and horrendous idea. But this, because he has also betrayed the laws of the city, again, another dreadful treachery, Creon feels this is an appropriate punishment. And Antigone, his sister, just cannot abide by this ruling that her brother should go unburied and without any sort of form of ritual burial. And so, in defiance of the law of the state, in defiance of her king, and also in defiance of her uncle, Creon is her uncle as well as her king, she performs a kind of token burial of her brother. Not once, in fact, but twice. She goes back to the body to try and continue to cover it more. She's caught in this, and the punishment for having breached the law is death, is execution. So Creon and Antigone are sort of thrown into confrontation. And Creon, of course, defends the idea that as a traitor to the city, he should remain unburied. These are both positions which are justifiable, right? Positions of justice. And he condemns Antigone to death, although he takes the rather cowardly option of burying her alive, of sealing her up in a cave alive, so he doesn't actively have to or directly cause her death, that her death will be sort of indirect. Although in the end, actually, she takes her own life, she hangs herself. And that is the sort of the main action, or the main sort of drama of the play that most people are familiar with. Of course, funnily enough, in the Sophoclean version, that all of Antigone goes off stage pretty much sort of just after halfway through the play itself, and what remains is the disintegration of Creon's position. So Creon's son, who is Antigone's fiance, begs for her life. Tiresias, the blind prophet, which we're familiar with from other sort of plays in the Theban cycle, tells Creon that the gods will be against what he's doing. Creon continues to defend his position, and in the end, both his wife and his son die. Kill themselves at the action of that he's taken in executing or seeking the death of Antigone, and Creon is left in a sort of situation of total catastrophe, of destruction at the end of the play, and Antigone dies resolute in the face of Creon's edict that she should not bury her brother, and she goes to her death without any sort of hesitation, if you like.
Thank you so much, Katie. That was really helpful. And Ed, how does that resonate with your experience of composing your Antigone?
I wrote Antigone in kind of two different periods of compositional work, basically. So initially, back in 2017, I wrote part one of Antigone, which was initially a freestanding project. And it was premiered at the Octagon at Queen Mary, with a mixture of professional singers and a professional pianist and students from Queen Mary who sang in the chorus. And this was a companion piece to Janacek's song cycle, The Diary of One Who Disappeared, which is for solo mezzo-soprano, solo tenor, piano, and a chorus of three female voices. So I was writing for the same lineup. And that was done at Queen Mary, as I say. And then I thought that I'd like to extend the and that initial project became part 1 of 3 of the chamber opera that we're talking about today. So part 1 of Antigone is actually from Sophocles' play Oedipus at Colonus, with Antigone recently having lost her father Oedipus. And then part 2 is about Antigone choosing or making the decision to bury Polynices against Creon's orders. And then part 3 is Antigone having already done that, having already buried her brother, and she's facing death because of Creon's punishment.
It's fascinating how you describe your work, Ed. It seems to me that there might even be a kind of really interesting and serendipitous kind of coincidence or fidelity to ancient tragedy, in as much as what you said about there not being much action actually corresponds to Athenian tragedy itself. So all the sort of dramatic action that we hear about is reported to characters on stage. You know, the deaths or sort of battles or any sort of big event is reported to characters. And in fact, where the real tragedy and dramatic action exists on the tragic stage, it's in these intense emotional exchanges between characters, these intensely verbal exchanges where all the emotion and any kind of action is sort of delivered in that manner. And that sounds very sort of similar to the tableau effect that you're describing that you have created in your piece of work.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought of it in that way, but yeah, I can totally see that makes sense. And certainly Antigone, the action cuts off a little while before her death, so that's again kind of implied rather than stated in any real sense.
Right.
And again, that seems to have the in media res effect that you get often in Greek tragedy and other literary forms, where you start in the middle of the story and then you see the plot develop through conversation. But in tragedy, it's the chorus and the song and the dance who look forwards and backwards and place that event into the bigger mythological picture. So by stripping back the chorus, I guess you're placing the events of your piece within a mythological tradition, which is within wider culture, maybe within visual arts and literature and other modern adaptations, rather than being within the piece itself, self-contained. And that's, I think, where Abbie could help us, because her PhD is looking at ultra-contemporary adaptations of Antigone and other forms of adaptation which draw on Antigone more and less obviously. So sometimes it's not so apparent, the references maybe within wider culture, within epigraphs and so
on. One of the I think it's the only play that I'm looking at in my thesis is Lila Rux's Antigone in terms of contemporary versions. And she strips back the bond in the play just to sisterhood. So it's quite interesting how you've got such few characters in your version of Antigone, and Lila Rux's literally just got Antigone and Ismene, and it stripped back the play just to make it about the bond of sisterhood. And I think that's something that we don't really see a lot of in Sophocles' Antigone, apart from some scattered moments throughout the play. And it's also interesting because Ismene also disappears halfway throughout the play in Sophocles' version, and we don't really know what happens to her. In Lila Rux's Antigone, we find out that Ismene actually lived for years after Antigone died, and she had a life and she had a family. I think it's really interesting that when you choose to concentrate on just one character or two characters in particular, you get a new story that you maybe wouldn't have heard.
That's really interesting, and my version went completely the other way, which was a completely kind of pragmatic decision based on what singers I had available. But yes, that completely changes the focus of what my adaptation is about, I guess.
What's, I think, also notable in what Abbie's saying about this play, that Lila Rux's decision to focus on the sister pair, or your decision to focus on Antigone in the chorus, or these other kinds of confrontations or pairings, is it begins to sort of raise the question about how we identify, or what we identify as Antigone tropes, or recognizably Antigone type scenes, like what makes an Antigone story an Antigone story.
I think in a sense, to me, the really powerful part of Antigone is this sense of an individual against a cruel state, and particularly an individual woman against a cruel state, and the kind of the power dynamics there. And in my opera, in my adaptation, Antigone is so much the main character. The male singer is Theseus in part 1 and Creon in part 3, both quite small roles, and doesn't appear in part 2. And the chorus have a bit more, but again, not masses. A lot of it is a long monologue for Antigone, and it's really trying to get inside her psyche, and kind of trying to understand what she's going through in the face of all of this stuff going on around her. So I guess I would see it as a psychological exploration of that character above anything else.
And that's why you chose to explore it through a monologue rather than in discussion with more of the other members of her family, as in Sophocles?
I mean, I think the artistic intention and the practical limitations, as ever when you're writing a piece of music, kind of interact quite closely. And I think there's a large degree to which the practical limitations of really not having enough singers to give her lots of family members kind of create the intention of it being very much about her doing a monologue. But certainly in terms of the final result that was produced, yeah, I mean, I would say absolutely, that's what it's about.
But again, I think that's fantastically kind of coincidental, because we know that, the Greek tragedy too begins with, only a couple of characters on stage, and as it evolves throughout the 5th century, the more and more actors are introduced to the stage. So at any one time, you might only have 3 actors, perhaps a chorus as well, on stage, and then certain actors would go off and play other roles. They'd come back and play other roles. So what you've done actually, because of the sort of the pragmatism of your scenario, actually weirdly kind of echoes what was happening on the Athenian stage. I think what's really interesting about what you said, and so I think on the nose about, it's the way in which Antigone comes to sort of symbolize a certain mode of resistance, or a kind of a rejection of, as you say, you said a cruel state, very often particular versions by Jean Anouilh and Bertolt Brecht, and that was as a resistance to fascism. So she was depicted in those sort of traditions as being a kind of heroine in resistance to fascist politics. But in the 19th century, she was sort of held up as a sort of spiritual figure who resisted the sort of noble religious figure defending divine rights against the state, and I think that is such a kind of persistently attractive and fascinating element of Antigone as a figure, which is why I think a lot of people do return to her to sort of try and then, as you said, to try and understand that. And again, but what's interesting is how modern I think your representation is in its own way, because what you said about the psychology of Antigone, and what Rachel pointed out about, by pursuing that through a monologue, that would be in some ways quite alien to an ancient audience.
So something that we found fascinating, Ed, in your programme notes, was the link to home fire, and the fact that you'd been perhaps inspired to look at Antigone out of all of the options available to you, all of the myths that you could have chosen. So thinking about ways of using the Antigone story, that individual against a state mechanism, and the idea of identifying what it is that makes an Antigone reception is something that Abbie's been working on in her thesis.
So with home fire, it's interesting because we actually know that it's an Antigone story without being told that it's an Antigone story. At the beginning, we're told that it's an Antigone story, like with the reviews at the front of the novel. And I think it is interesting as you go through the book and you are able to identify elements that make the Antigone story. Of course, you've got the female that's in resistance against the state, but also I think with home fire is really interesting. I think there's more added to the Antigone story in terms of there's issues about citizenship and immigration that aren't necessarily as pertinent to the Sophocles Antigone story as they are to Home Fire.
So the additional political elements that have been drawn out of the myth and used in different ways to reach different genres, different audiences, and to be updated in different ways.
Although one could also say that what's really fascinating is, whilst, as Abbie has pointed out and is pointing out in her research, there's this really crucial introduction of these elements of, as you say, immigration and contemporary Muslim identity within the UK, which of course are entirely contemporary concerns. What is in a way persistent, and I'd like to hear whether Ed sort of would like, wants that to be drawn out in his own work. What is persistent is that what, generations of philosophers and playwrights and musicians and artists have done with Antigone is precisely to ask questions about their own contemporary moment, political questions, ethical questions, questions about justice and the law, what we should do.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of yes and no. So the initial project that we were doing, just with the part one of Antigone that I mentioned earlier, that was put on in collaboration with Queen Mary Geography, and there was a theme of child migrants and child refugees in that concert. And that was part of what prompted me to use Antigone. Antigone, in that sense, being a child migrant. So that was very explicitly relating to a very particular modern crisis. Those thoughts didn't influence my writing of the music. In the compositional process, I was just writing about Antigone quite straightforwardly. And there are no political references, certainly nothing on the level of the Camilla Shamsi. But I think, in a sense, it would be impossible to do an Antigone without those questions being there implicitly as a function of reception, even if not a function of composition. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think it's politics with a small p. When I'm teaching this text to students, I teach it in translation to students in Queen Mary, the idea that we might at any point in our lives enter into a situation in which our personal politics or our personal sense of self or our family clashes with the structures, the political or legal structures in which we find ourselves, is, I think, a very immediately recognizable sort of phenomenon. We might, and often, the example I might use would be, if somebody hurt a member of your family, your most immediate response might be to seek sort of bloody revenge, right? You might want to immediately do harm to the person who harmed you or your family. That would go in direct contradiction of state law. You're not supposed to, attack somebody else, and so you have to kind of channel your frustration through legal structures. But the immediate sense of retribution might be very immediate and real to people. And I think that Antigone, ignites that kind of sense.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Katie Fleming, Abbie Jukes, Edward Nesbit, and I look forward to hearing the piece now.